at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good afternoon, you're watching The Discussion with me, Inaya Folarin Iman. We discuss the big moral, cultural and political questions of our time. Is it possible to have an ethical foreign policy? Are ideals worth fighting and even dying for? The morality of surrogacy and much more. But first, here's the bulletins.
Thanks, Anaya. It's 3 o'clock. I'm Simon Pusey from the GB newsroom. Ukraine's presidential advisor says front lines have practically frozen because Russia doesn't have enough troops to make further advances. Meanwhile, Mariupol's city council says thousands of Ukrainians have been taken by force across the border to Russia. Fighting is still said to be going on in the city after an art school where around 400 people were taking shelter was also bombed. There's still no word on casualties, but the city council confirmed that the building was destroyed and there were still victims under the rubble. President Zelensky described the horror of the attack in an address to the nation.
The blockade of Mariupol will go down in history of responsibility for war crimes. To do what the occupiers did to a peaceful city is a terror that will be remembered for centuries to come. And the more Ukrainians tell the world about it, the more support we find. The more Russia uses terror against Ukraine, the worse the consequences will be for it.
President Zelensky there. Meanwhile, the former head of the British Army, General Sir Mike Jackson, has told GB News he couldn't rule out the possibility of World War III, saying President Putin's objective is to rebuild the old Soviet Union.
It seems to me the only way that we can bring this dreadful war to an end is for Putin to accept that his original aims are unachievable.
The Prime Minister is urging China to join the global community in its disapproval of the war in Ukraine. Boris Johnson believes some of President Xi Jinping's team is having second thoughts about Beijing's neutral position on the invasion. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister is also facing fierce criticism after comparing the struggle of Ukrainians fighting Russian forces to Britain's voting for Brexit. Here's what he said at the Tory party spring conference yesterday.
And I know that it's the instinct of the people of this country, like the people of Ukraine, to choose freedom every time. When the British people voted for Brexit in such large numbers, I don't believe it was because they were remotely hostile to foreigners. It's because they wanted to be free, to do things differently and for this country to be able to run itself.
6 people have been killed and 10 others seriously injured after a car ploughed into a crowd in Belgium. The incident happened in a small village about 30 miles south of the capital, Brussels. Police say the vehicle was driven at high speed into a group of carnival performers who were preparing for a parade. 2 people have been arrested. The incident is not thought to be terror-related. A member of the carnival troupe says the day was a disaster.
It was supposed to be a celebration day, but it turned out to be a tragedy. A car drove into the procession. We saw bodies flying everywhere. It was horrible.
Police have named the teenager who was murdered in central London yesterday. 19-year-old Sabita Tawani was found with serious neck injuries at a student accommodation in Clerkenwell. Detectives are now searching for 22-year-old Meher Marouf, who they believe was in a relationship with her. Police say he's a Tunisian national but is not a student and has no fixed address. Millions of people in England will begin to be offered COVID booster jabs this week. The NHS says the vaccine will be available to care home residents, those over 75 and the immunosuppressed, aged 12 and over. 5 million people are expected to be given the jab. Government ministers reportedly knew P&O Ferries' plan to slash 800 jobs before staff members were told. The Sunday Times says it received a leaked memo from a senior Whitehall official trying to justify the redundancies by saying without these decisions, an estimated 2,200 staff would likely lose their jobs. According to the Rail, Maritime and Transport Union, the replacement workforce will be on contracts which pay below the minimum wage. The Duke and Duchess of Cambridge will learn about efforts to preserve Belize's barrier reef as they continue their Caribbean tour. William and Kate spent time with the country's Prime Minister on day 2 of their 8-day trip, marking the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. Their visit hasn't been without controversy, though, with some residents protesting against the royal couple's arrival and helicopter landing site. And a toy company in Chicago has raised over £110,000 for Ukraine by selling President Zelensky's Lego figurines. The unofficial's Lego toys went on sale with a price tag of £75 and sold out within hours. All funds from the sales will go towards medical aid for Ukraine. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now let's return to the discussion.
Welcome to the discussion. Before I get into my first big subject, I'm joined in the studio right now by Janice Williams, chair of the anti-sexual exploitation organisation Object. I just wanted to get your reaction on some of the stories that we've seen in the last few weeks. Firstly, Leah Thomas won an American national swimming competition, and the big factor that's caused this to be a national news story is the fact that Leah is a male and has won. And what's your reaction to that? Is this the end of women's sports, or is this what some would regard a step forward for inclusion?
It could be the end of women's sport, very, very sadly. It may take us some years to learn this lesson. How many events do we have to see where a mediocre man enters as a woman?
Yes, I mean, they were
all the
400.
stunning, fantastic female athletes who spent their lives training. We've seen it with swimming, we've seen it with various events.
Wrestling as
well. Do we
well.
have to see it for another 30 years before somebody says, oh, maybe it wasn't such a good idea? Do something about it now, please.
Yeah, I mean, I really worry about the young girls who look at the sports stars and think, I could be that one day if I train, if I discipline myself, if I work hard. And actually, there's one thing that they literally cannot be, is be a male.
They cannot get male puberty and that big testosterone boost. They cannot get those big muscles, those spurts of speed and strength. They will never get them.
I mean, how have we got to this point? I mean, it does seem... You know, to me, this is cheating, quite frankly.
It is cheating.
I think that we have to be really honest here. This is cheating. This is unfair. And I really do worry about whether or not this person has any shame, because most people are looking at this and thinking this is not a fair competition. But Leah Thomas is still continuing to do this.
And the authorities, who are invisible, they are in dereliction of their duty. Leah Thomas, OK, she's seizing an advantage. I do agree that Leah Thomas is a cheat, but I really, really blame the authorities behind the scenes who are taking a salary and, I'm an authority on sport. They are a disgrace.
I think that's an important point, because a lot of people have said, these young girls should stand up and they should speak out. But actually, that could be harming their own reputation, their job prospects. They're so young. Why should they be expected?
Exactly.
Surely it's the institution's responsibility to make sure that there is fair competition.
That is victim blaming. Of course, it's the authorities' job, and they're not doing it. And they should be replaced if they don't do it.
Yeah, and I mean, this whole gender and sex debate has been a really big debate over the last few years, but it does seem to have very significant material consequences. We've seen in the last few years and in the last few weeks stories of male sex offenders being recorded as women because of how they identify. I mean, now this is skewing real crime statistics.
Yes, I mean, the statistics currently show that I think 90-something% of sexual offences are committed mostly against women, but also against men, by men. If we keep on recording the statistics as people would like them to be, if they're a trans person, then it'll end up saying 50-50. And people will say, there's no problem, we don't need to worry about that. And women will be preyed on even more than they historically have been. And let's face it, it's been going on for 5,000 years of patriarchy. It's time we stopped it.
Well, we will come back to you very soon, Janice. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. In other news, Russia's invasion of Ukraine sparked revulsion from the international community, with Western countries responding with condemnation and far-reaching economic sanctions against the Russian regime. Most notably, the UK, US and EU, to varying degrees, have placed sanctions on Russian oil and gas. However, with several Western countries significantly dependent on Russia for their energy supply, for example, the European Union gets 40% of its natural gas from Russia, countries have been looking to other regimes to meet their needs for cheap energy, such as Saudi Arabia, Venezuela and even Iran. But with all of these regimes accused of serious and often extreme human rights abuses, is it even possible to have an ethical foreign policy? I'm joined now by James Dorsey, the award-winning foreign correspondent on ethnic and religious conflict. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. Firstly, what do you make of America looking to Saudi Arabia and even Venezuela, for that matter, for their energy needs in response to the energy crisis that has been partly precipitated by the sanctions against Russia?
Well, as a matter of principle, obviously, it's fairly ironic that one turns to a country that is invading and bombing its neighbor to try and sort out a problem caused by another country, both of them autocracies, that also is invading its neighbor. So clearly there's something wrong here. But it does go to the very fundamental question that you asked at the top of this discussion, which is, can you have an ethical foreign policy? And I think the answer is you can, in the sense you can have ideals, and you will not always be able to carry out policies in line with those ideals. The trick to make that credible is basically to explain on what criteria and why you decide on a case-to-case basis when to apply your values and when not.
I mean, on that point with Saudi Arabia, I mean, there's still so many unanswered questions in relation to Khashoggi. There was 81 people executed, I think, in one day last week. You mentioned or alluded to the war in Yemen. And we know about Saudi Arabia exporting Wahhabi Salafist versions of Islam across the globe. I mean, why do you think that we have a more softer relationship, so to speak, with the Saudi regime?
Well, first of all, just for reasons of accuracy, to be fair to the Saudis, and yes, there was the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, for which they should be held accountable. Yes, they have a justice system which is very questionable. And yes, there is massive abuse of human rights. But to be fair, they have by and large stopped the funding of an ultra-conservative interpretation of Islam since about 2015, and have tried to promote what I would call an autocratic version of Islam. And that goes to why are countries often willing to look the other way with the Saudis? One, because obviously Saudi Arabia is the world's swing oil producer. So if you have to compensate for, on a short-term basis, for a loss of oil in the market, for example, Russian oil, then the Saudis are the ones who can do that on the spot. Another reason is simply that they are the custodians of the holy places, Mecca and Medina, and therefore wield significant influence in the Islamic world. Now, the question is whether or not one could achieve those objectives while at the same time pressuring the Saudis to be more forthcoming on issues like human rights. We mentioned the executions this week. That was basically a snub for Prime Minister Boris Johnson. The 81 were in the same week, and a day before he arrived in Saudi Arabia, there were another 3 executions. So he had a total of 84 in 1 week.
I mean, on that point about the fact that they may have stopped funding some more extreme versions of kind of fundamentalist Islam, I mean, do you buy that they have been liberalising then? I mean, many people have said Mohammed bin Salman has been relaxing certain laws. We know in the last few years that women have been allowed to drive, for example. I mean, do you buy that they have been liberalising?
I think we've got to be precise about what we're talking about. So the Saudis, for more than 4 decades, funded the propagation of a very ultra-conservative form of Islam that they practiced at home, primarily for geopolitical reasons. They, in 2015, with the rise of the Salmans, King Salman and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, they have stopped doing so, and they have introduced far-reaching, not far enough, but nonetheless far-reaching social reforms. None of those reforms or changes have been anchored in religious law. They are anchored in Saudi law. They are anchored in decrees by the government. But there has been no change of the theology as such that the kingdom has adhered to since its founding in 1932. The only thing that has changed is that they now reach out for interfaith dialogue. I think that's more a move designed to improve the kingdom's reputation rather than something real happening on the ground. You still cannot build a non-Muslim house of worship in the kingdom itself. And they have stopped propagating and pouring huge amounts of money into religious ultra-conservatism beyond their borders.
Thank you so much for bringing us that insight, James Dorsey, award-winning foreign correspondent on ethnic and religious conflict. Thank you very much. Well, are ideals worth fighting for? The morality of surrogacy? And why have some right-wing figures seemed to express some sympathy towards Putin? But first, it's the weather.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking dry and clear for many, though it will chill off after sunset. Let's take a look at the details. Firstly, in the far southwest, there'll be some more cloud around here this evening, and perhaps even the odd spot of rain, but that cloud will keep temperatures up. Over to the east, and a clear, calmer end to the weekend, though in any rural areas it will start to feel pretty chilly around dusk. Moving back to the west, and in South Wales, there'll continue to be hardly a cloud in the sky tonight, chilly here as well. Next now to the Midlands, where you can see the odd spot of fog and mist developing this evening, but otherwise a clear and cool end to the day after a sunny-filled weekend. Now moving further east, and there will be more cloud across northeast England this evening, and in coastal areas a chance of some very light rain, though inland it will also be pretty chilly. Whizzing over to Scotland now, chilly here, especially in the breeze, but staying clear and dry for all, with some mistiness developing at low levels. Finally, we go to Northern Ireland, where it has been a little cloudier so far today, and this evening it will remain mostly cloudy, but that does mean it won't feel too cold. By Monday morning, temperatures will have dipped across the UK, so it will be a clear and crisp start to the week, and that is how the weather is shaping up overnight and into tomorrow morning.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood, and every weekday we bring you The Briefing live from 9:30 a.m. The stories, analysis, and live debate that you need to hear.
Quite right, Tom, of course.
Was this something that had been considered at all?
Difficult to answer.
Gas-guzzling helicopters circling. Noise is being made here.
Joe Biden walking out.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, Monday to Friday, 9:30 a.m. on GB News.
Join me, Gloria De Piero, Monday to Thursday at noon for The Briefing. We go to the parts of Parliament that you won't see elsewhere. Plus, there's exclusive interviews with MPs from all parties.
But quite often, they paper over the real truth. Why does a working class lad like you join the Tories?
That's a good question.
Don't miss it, Monday to Thursdays at noon on GB News.
It was reported this week that a group of more than a dozen babies were sheltering in a basement in Kiev with their nannies and nurses. These babies were surrogate babies where their biological parents had so far been unable to collect them because of the war. Ukraine is a global surrogacy hub where, according to estimates, 2,500 to 3,000 children are born in Ukraine every year for clients outside of the country, including China, the United States and the EU. In Ukraine, the entire surrogacy process costs the equivalent of £42,000, and it is one of the rare countries in the world to allow mothers to carry babies for foreigners as a commercial practice. Is the practice of commercial surrogacy dehumanising and exploitative to both mothers and children, or merely an unconventional way for people who long to be parents to realise that possibility? Well, I'm joined in the studio by Janice Williams, Chair of Object, Ella Whedon, journalist and co-convener of the Battle of Ideas Festival, and Grace Stark, writer and editor of Natural Womanhood. Thank you all for joining me. I'll start with you, Grace. Is commercial surrogacy, in your view, dehumanising?
Absolutely. Just in the way that you introduced the subject just now, using terms like collecting children, intended parents as clients. This is a commercial operation. These are all terms that we use to describe economic transactions. And it obscures the fact that what we're actually talking about are human lives. We're talking about women's bodies. We're talking about the lives of children. I think that there's no question that it's dehumanizing, because at any point when we're using economic terms to describe bodies and lives, there's no way around that being exploitative, that being coercive, and ultimately dehumanizing.
Ella, what do you make of some of the arguments that Grace has just put forward, and also those who say that overwhelmingly the women who do this are impoverished? They perhaps wouldn't have done it otherwise if they had other financial means, and it's effectively reproducing forms of inequality where wealthy people in wealthy parts of the world pay to use women in poorer parts of the world as incubators, as some people might describe it. What do you say?
I think for me, this really comes down to a question of women's bodily autonomy. And if you believe in women's bodily autonomy, as I do, and think that a woman should be free to choose what she does with her body and what decisions she makes about her body, that's from abortion, which I think should be decriminalised, it should be completely up to a woman, right through to things like prostitution and indeed things like surrogacy. It doesn't really matter what we personally feel about the process of surrogacy. I'm not a huge fan. I certainly couldn't do it myself, but I would not want to either legislate against or control another woman's decision to do it. I think we should be very clear that we're not talking about instances where women are coerced into this, which does happen across the world, and that's a problem and should be stopped. But in instances where women make the choice to do it commercially or otherwise, even in situations that we don't like, whether it be because she's poor or something like that, we need to take a very clear, principled stand for women's bodily autonomy. You can quite easily compare it to abortion. There are many decisions that women make to have an abortion, which lots of people don't like, whether it be because she can't afford a baby, whether it be because she doesn't want a baby. It's not for anyone else to make that decision other than her. And I think it's quite clear that in relation to surrogacy, when it comes to decisions about women's bodies, it's the same principle.
Well, I guess critics would say that when it comes to abortion, that's preventing a pregnancy from happening. When it comes to surrogacy, this is that the pregnancy is going to term, the child is being born, and they're having their life determined from the get-go, where they're being taken away from the parent that gave birth to them. Isn't it different in that sense?
No, because I think what you misunderstand, people who make that argument misunderstand what's at stake in relation to abortion. It's primarily the priority has to be the woman, it's her body and it's her decision. And so therefore the emphasis is always on the woman's freedom. And that's why abortion rights campaigners like me or anyone who believes in women's bodily autonomy prioritizes the fact that it's a woman's life at stake rather than anything else. The woman comes first. And it doesn't matter if that's terminating a pregnancy. It doesn't matter if that's your decision to take a pregnancy to term. I really feel extremely uncomfortable and skeptical about the discussion around natural motherhood. As someone who is going through fertility treatment myself, I understand that just because you are a woman doesn't mean naturally you are able to become a natural mother. Sometimes you need a helping hand. There are lots of an intervention. So when discussing kind of natural womanhood, I think we get into quite dangerous biological determinist territory where we suggest that either women who don't go along the natural route or can't go along the natural route are somehow less than, and I think we should always avoid that.
Janice, I mean, what do you say to Ella's argument? There's twofold there. First is the question of women's bodily autonomy, you know, deciding what they do with their own body, and this is part of it, even the right to make choices that other people might disagree with. And the second one is the reality that many women and parents more broadly want to have children and sometimes are not able to. And oftentimes this is, you know, not their first choice, it's their last resort, but they're fulfilling the desire that they would like, which is to have children. What would you say to those arguments?
Of course, women have to have the right to abortion. With surrogacy, however, it's not just the woman's life that's concerned. You're bringing a new life into existence, and that child also has rights. Surrogacy arrangements suggested by the government will go against the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, not in 1 or 2 ways, but in 10 or 15 ways. We have to think about the legal cases that will be brought by these children when they get to the age of discretion, and they think, who had the right to put me through this? Who had the right to take me from my mother and, I would say, sell me to somebody else? There are big problems. Of course I'm sympathetic to people that are struggling to have children. I've been in that position myself. However, I'm also very sympathetic to people who desperately need a cigarette or desperately need a drink, when actually it may harm them to do that. And the fact that I'm desperately sympathetic to them doesn't mean that those things that they do will not cause harm. You have to have that distinction very, very clearly. Surrogacy is also very, very open to abuse. There was the Japanese man who created 16 children because he had plenty of money and wanted a large family. That's child abuse in the making. Children deserve better than that. There was the Australian convicted paedophile who got through the checks because there aren't any checks. It's a buying and selling situation. And we should really be looking very, very closely at people. I've got no doubt that you would pass all the tests with flying colours, no doubt at all, but there are other people who don't. And a large number of men now are going for surrogacy on their own, and I have to say they need to be checked out.
Just, I'll come back to you in just a moment, Grace. I just want to drill down on that point, Ella, about the fact that there is a child now involved, which makes it slightly different from abortion. I mean, what do you say to the child who, you know, finds out that that is how they kind of came into being? I mean, do you not have any sympathy with the argument about the rights of a child to contest that whole idea that this is an okay thing to do?
Well, we know already that the similar situations happen in relation to adoption. This isn't something that's particular to surrogacy. We know that, people have all kinds of difficulty in their lives. And but the question is whether or not you bring in, and let's just stop being disingenuous for a second. Campaigns against surrogacy are primarily not about a question of children's rights, but are usually about talking about exploitation of women, which is fine if that's your argument. But what I'm arguing is that if you believe in a woman's freedom over her bodily autonomy, which I'm glad to hear that I think my fellow panelists do, then you have to set a precedent and hold a principle on a woman's freedom to make decisions about her body, whether or not you think that's right or not, and whether or not a future child thinks that's right or not. That's why I'm talking about the priority over a woman's body. Because in the instance of a pregnant woman who either wants to terminate a pregnancy or wants to carry that pregnancy to term to then give it to another family or another couple or whatever, the decision is about what happens to her body in the here and now, and that's what the law should allow. So legislating against surrogacy for whatever future reason of a prospective child is, quite frankly, sacrificing a woman's freedom in the here and now for some imagined or possible future. And as someone who cares very deeply about women's freedom, I think that's a very dangerous precedent to set for a number of reasons, not least in relation to abortion.
And Grace, what would you say to some of the points that Ella has raised? I mean, a range of them, but particularly the one that is critiquing the idea of natural womanhood, because the reality is some women, for whatever reason, are not able to have children, quote unquote, naturally, and therefore they are using other means in order to do that. I mean, what do you make of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we need to remember that no one has the right to a child. I myself have struggled with infertility in the past. And at the end of the day, we need to realize that no one has the right to have a child. No one has the right to possess another human being. No one has the right to create another human being. These are the issues that arise with surrogacy. And when I hear folks kind of bang the drum of autonomy and choice, it rings a little bit hollow in the face of women who clearly did not choose to be surrogates, who did not choose to essentially be trafficked for their wombs. It sounds to me like in protecting autonomy at all costs and hiding that and holding that as our highest ideal, rather, that we've just accepted that coercion and exploitation is the price that we pay. And the women who end up paying that price are poor women, largely in developing countries. The children who are then abandoned for, not meeting the exact specifications of the commissioning parents. And there have been several high-profile stories of that in the last several years. Because again, going back to the language that we use even to talk about this issue, you read about how these parents go through a catalog and choose the perfect egg. They choose the perfect surrogate. They choose the perfect piece of sperm or sperm sample from the perfect donor to create a child to their exact specifications. And it sounds a lot less like creating human life than it is, I'm renovating my kitchen right now. It sounds like how you go about picking different contractors to do the finished work in your kitchen. And this is not the kind of language that we should be describing at all when we're talking about human life and the creation of human life. It's coercive, it's exploitative.
Well, thank you.
Can I?
Just quickly, 10 seconds quickly, Ella, just to respond quickly.
When you get into the realm of judging what decision a woman makes in relation to a future pregnancy or indeed her own body, then you get into very dangerous territory.
Okay.
There are lots of religious people, for example.
I'm really sorry. I'm going to have to end this now. Thank you, Janice Williams, Chair of Object, Grace Stark, writer and editor of Natural Womanhood, and Ella Wheeler, journalist and co-convener of the Battle of Ideas charity. Thank you so much. We have all of this discussion and much more coming up just after the bulletins. Thank you.
Hello, it's just gone 3:33. I'm Simon Pusey in the GB newsroom. Ukraine's presidential advisor says front lines have practically frozen because Russia doesn't have enough troops to make further advances. Meanwhile, Mariupol City Council says thousands of Ukrainians have been taken by force across the border to Russia. Fighting is still said to be ongoing in the city after an art school where around 400 people were taking shelter was also bombed. There's still no word on casualties, but the city council confirmed that the building was destroyed and there were victims under the rubble. Police have arrested 22-year-old Meher Marouf on suspicion of murder following the death of Sabita Tawani in central London. It's believed the Tunisian national was in a relationship with the 19-year-old student. She was found with serious neck injuries at her university accommodation in Clerkenwell yesterday. 6 people have been killed and 10 others seriously injured after a car ploughed into a crowd in Belgium. The incident happened in a small village about 30 miles south of the capital. Brussels police say the vehicle was driven at high speed into a group of carnival performers who were preparing for a parade. 2 people have been arrested. The incident's not thought to be terror-related. Millions of people in England will begin to be offered COVID booster jabs this week. The NHS says the vaccine will be available to care home residents, those over 75 and the immunosuppressed aged 12 and over. 5 million people are expected to be given the jab. You're up to date for now, but plenty more on all the main stories at the top of the next hour.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
There's been much discussion over the last few years in the West about whether the ideals of freedom, self-determination and sovereignty were losing their cultural authority against a backdrop of globalisation and technocratic rule, that relative peace and prosperity had left us either not needing to or disconnected from the struggle to realise these ideals. This has led many Western observers to be struck by the strength of the resistance from the Ukrainian people in the name of freedom and self-determination against Russian military aggression, and has raised questions, several questions that is, about whether the struggle for greater freedom today really matters. Are ideals worth fighting for? Have we become disconnected from the brutal reality of war and violence? Or conversely, is the demand to do more militarily an example of self-destructive nihilism? How would the realisation that war is a possibility in the here and now change our society? I'm joined now by Paul Ingram, Academic Programme Manager and Senior Research Associate at the Centre for Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge, and also Peter Caddick-Adams, historian and military analysis. Thank you so much both for joining me this afternoon. Firstly, I'll start with you, Paul. I know that you've been involved in campaigns for against nuclear weapons, if I'm right, but more specifically on war. Do you believe that there are certain ideals worth fighting, if not dying for?
Well, I think there are ideals that are worth dying for, but I don't think that that's the question today that we face. The question today is about risks and the way in which we are being encouraged to consider taking very serious risks for very dubious outcomes, because we have confronted Russia, we have put the largest amount of sanctions on that we have on any large country. We have faced down Putin, but now we've got the choice between escalating further or sticking and waiting it out, because Putin's got a very weak hand at the moment, and we have the danger, if we escalate this, of giving him back the initiative.
Do you disregard or disagree, let's say, with calls that has existed over the last few weeks to implement a no-fly zone in Ukraine?
Very strongly. The implementation of a no-fly zone is essentially a declaration of a declaration of war against Russia. The reason for that is because you would have to make the skies safe for your own aircraft, which would mean taking out radar, surface-to-air missiles and other equipment that the Russians have both inside Ukraine and in Russia and Belarus. So you would be firing missiles into Russia, you would be dominating the air, and it wouldn't even necessarily be effective unless you were willing to use the air to bomb ground forces, because most of the missiles and rockets that Russia are firing are either being fired from aircraft inside Russia or Belarus, or they're being fired from the ground. So it's ineffective, deeply risky, and we risk giving Putin the advantage, because he can then point at us and say, look, we are now the aggressors. NATO is the aggressor, and we're now on the defensive. But currently, his beef is with Ukraine and with the West supplying Ukraine. But that's one step back from being in a state of war with Russia, which I think is deeply undesirable. I understand the wish to do the right thing. I understand the wish to do something. But we are doing a lot at the moment, and the risk is that we go into a conflict where we're throwing the dice on some pretty damn dangerous things, not just nuclear war, chemical war, escalation of conventional war, almost a certainty. Deaths going up from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, and if nuclear war, hundreds of millions. So this isn't about selfishness or doing the right thing. It's actually about avoiding mass murder on a massive scale, which we haven't been seeing yet.
Peter, do you agree with Paul? I mean, as a military historian, I mean, do you not see deterrence, for example, as needing to have a proper deterrence? Everything needs to be on the table. The enemy, so to speak, needs to know that actually their enemy would be willing to take whatever it takes measures in order to prevent them from taking that act. So do you agree with Paul, or do you agree with the assessment that I've put forward, that actually you need to have everything on the table to have a proper deterrent?
Well, I'm in agreement with Paul in all sorts of ways. The current agenda is one of terror. This is really what Russia is doing in Ukraine, and encouraging almost the rest of the world to up the ante and respond. Russia has already used several different ways of terrorizing people. It's weaponized refugees, it's weaponized information. It's used a wide variety of weapons against civilians. And in a way, this is trying to panic NATO and the Western world and divide them. The EU and NATO are pretty united in their opposition to Russia, but there is a two-track process going on. Some are quite hawkish about further involvement. The closer to Russia you are, the more involved you want to be. The further away, the more nervous you are about getting sucked into what could be a wider European war. And I think what's at stake here, I mean, Paul used the analogy of a throwing a dice on the table. I don't think anyone's talking about gambling. Everyone's talking about risk here, and the two are very different. That's why NATO is reluctant to get involved and reluctant to go down the route of a no-fly zone. It's extraordinarily difficult to manage. And the one thing we do see about this conflict is it's leaking into other countries already. The missile strikes this last week at Lviv and near the Polish border were both sets of missiles were released outside Ukrainian airspace, one from the Black Sea, one from Russian airspace. So already it's extraordinarily difficult to contain. And the point about Russia's continued aggression is it's threatening chemical warfare. It's threatening nuclear weapons. I think that's a bluff. And that's a bluff to scare the opponents, in other words, NATO and the Western world, into not doing anything and dividing their unity that they have at the moment.
But Peter, I mean, a counter-argument would be, if you look at regimes like Iran, they have been sanctioned, marginalised and isolated for a number of years now, and that hasn't necessarily caused their leaders to be toppled or all of those types of things that some observers have been predicting. And we know that, for example, China has been looking very closely at Taiwan, and it would be much more difficult for us within the West to sanction them and take the kinds of measures that we have taken against Russia. So it is, I guess the question that I'm trying to ask is that, is this assumption that things are going to escalate into World War I almost perhaps dare I say, a kind of cowardice on our part, rather than facing the reality that war is here in the here and now, and we have to do what it takes in order to meet that reality, such as, for example, Germany remilitarizing effectively?
Well, I think NATO has been very measured and very sensible in deciding there's no point in rushing headlong into anything I mean, the point about wars is you never end up with the end state that you intend when a war begins. You can never, ever plan and navigate the way warfare goes. And so the best thing is not to go there in the first place. But I think what we have to separate is international diplomacy from morality. And the two are really rather different things. And at the moment, there are a lot of people running around saying it's immoral that we don't get involved and try and stop this campaign in Ukraine. It's actually very, very difficult to achieve. And people are trying to wave a magic wand and quote the United Nations as if the UN can go in and everybody will suddenly stop. Sometimes, and it's a very sad thing to say, sides have to exhaust themselves and culminate. In other words, they can't go on any longer. And therefore, they want peace. They want to come to the table. And at the moment, Zelensky has offered peace, but Russia is not ready to go there. And you can't then get peace enforcement until both sides are ready to agree that package. And that's when a no-fly zone would come in, for example, but not at the moment.
Paul, it's a practical question of de-escalation to prevent greater bloodshed and violence rather than a kind of moral question, in your view.
Yeah, well, it's both. I would tend to part company on the morality. I think the morality is very important. But, morality is never black and white. There is a strong morality to avoiding escalating this, moving from a situation where, as I say, tens of thousands of people have lost their lives, in the lower tens of thousands, to a situation where hundreds of thousands or more start to lose their lives. And if we are talking about morality, where is our morality when it comes to intervening in Ethiopia, where the government has currently killed 500,000 Tigrayans?
Just quickly on that point. Just quickly on that point, Paul. I mean, what do you say to those who say that this invasion by Russia is not just about Ukraine? This has implications for European Western civilization as a whole, and that's why we treat it differently from perhaps some of the other atrocities and wrongdoing that's gone on in other parts of the world. What do you say that this is specific and actually has wider implications?
Well, every situation is different, but I was just drawing comparisons here around morality. So you're now using hard-nosed self-interest arguments, which are very relevant and appropriate. But nevertheless, when it comes to morality, I think we have to actually see this from a global perspective. Now, is there a very strong argument for being involved in Ukraine because it's right on our doorstep and because it's going to affect geopolitics of Europe? My point there would be, if we are interested in having stable geopolitics moving forward, then I think we've gone far enough in confronting Russia. Russia's options now are pretty much carry on in Ukraine and exhaust themselves. They cannot occupy the country and have any greater success than the Americans had in Iraq, or indeed they had and the Americans had in Afghanistan. This is a lose-lose situation for Putin, and the best way we can ensure European security moving forward is ensuring that the Russians lose without being drawn into a much bigger conflict with NATO. Okay. They couldn't then use their nuclear weapons, and we would have an opportunity to get together and build a new Europe together. That's what's needed. Russia needs to be in. Okay. We can't have Europe without Russia in there.
Well, thank you both. I'm really sorry we're going to have to cut this short. Hopefully we can bring you both back soon. Really fascinating discussion. Thank you so much. Paul Ingram from the University of Cambridge and Peter Caddick-Adams, historian and military analysis. In our final discussion, Putin's aggression towards Ukraine, as we've just discussed, has sparked widespread horror and disgust. However, there has been a small but significant minority, seemingly, of commentary from the right that express, let's say, strong scepticism towards mainstream Western commentary on the invasion. This has come in varying forms. Some have placed responsibility of the invasion on NATO and the West, or expressed sympathy towards Russia's values and overall outlook of family, Christianity and country. And some have defended Russia's supposed aims of so-called denazifying Ukraine. It's been a bit of a mix. But all in all, it has raised questions as to why those on the right wing of the political spectrum, generally associated with defending the gains of Western civilization, why some would take this line of argument. Is this mere diversity of opinion or an indication of an unhealthy cynicism and distrust? Let's get more on this from Eric Kaufman, professor at Birkbeck University of London. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon, Professor Kaufman. Firstly, what do you make of this rise in this particular perspective on some sections of the conservative thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a rise, but I do think at the extremes of right and left, you have this almost Putin apologism. And especially if we look at the United States, we look at the comments of people like Tucker Carlson, who has the most popular show on Fox News, for example. If we look at J.D. Vance, a popular Ohio Republican, I mean, they were more critical of the Ukraine than they have been of Putin. In fact, we're making excuses for Putin while being very tough on Ukraine and arguing that it had problems. How do we explain then this warmth towards Putin on sections of the right? Well, I think the way I would tend to analyze this is a number of ways. I mean, the first is that they have been very, rightly, in my view, very opposed to some of the cultural trends, such as wokeism. They've been very opposed to the way the U.S. has handled its southern border. But then, instead of simply sticking with the problem of ideas, the idea of the culture war, the battle of ideas, they've transposed this into a political economy grand theory that there are these globalist elites upholding the rules-based international liberal order, and that order has to somehow be attacked. And so, instead of going after the cultural problems, which they've done very effectively, and which I agree with them in a lot of these, they are now going after political liberalism and the rules-based order. And so that then means that someone who is challenging that rules-based liberal order like Putin becomes kind of a good guy, and defending that rules-based order, anyone who's defending it becomes kind of a bad guy. And so you have this strange warmth towards Putin because he's sort of he's the enemy of our enemy, he becomes our friend. And that logic, I think, unfortunately, has gripped the minds of a number of populist conservative commentators who have said many sensible things on domestic cultural issues, and I think have lost credibility by sort of squandering that political capital on these questions where they're really on the wrong side. I think some of them have backpedaled a little bit, such as Carlson, but I just genuinely think this is part of a sort of a mistaken read of where their problems are coming from. They're blaming this sort of global world order, of a liberal world order, and I think it's very, very lazy theorizing, and it's not based on evidence and data. The way, for example, their cultural analysis, for example, of moral panics over, say, the Covington boys, over the excesses of George Floyd protests, all of that was based on hard evidence and data, such as spikes in crime rates. However, this stuff about Davos and the Great Reset and the liberal world order is, in my view, verging on sort of a neo-Marxist conspiracy theory. And I'm afraid this has sort of lost them credibility that they really need to fight some of the cultural issues.
Do you think some of this is because they genuinely feel powerless? I mean, I tend to think that when I see conspiracy theories on the rise, I think it's often, sense-making is breaking down, people feel a loss of control and are creating these kind of grand narratives to make sense of the world. And many people on the right, the culture right in particular, have felt left out and shut out of the way kind of society has been changed. The conversation have felt a bit disillusioned and alienated, and perhaps they see Putin as this strong man, this male figure that's going to save the day. I mean, is it perhaps a sign of a sense of disorientation and powerlessness on the right, that it's lost confidence in itself?
I think it's not so much losing confidence in itself, but you are correct that some of them look to Putin as sort of upholding a sort of macho white Christian society. I think that analysis is highly flawed in many ways, because if you actually look at Russia, it's not a particularly religious place amongst the population. It is actually more concerned with restoring territorial imperial expansion than it is concerned with protecting a particular ethnicity or culture. So I actually think that's a mistaken analysis. But I also think that some analysts on the right have sort of made a category error in going after liberalism, political liberalism, instead of a more specific ideology, which I call left modernism, which is behind things such as trashing national history, promoting, wokeness and the trans agenda and critical race theory and these sorts of things. That is not necessary to liberalism, and it is not. But by targeting liberalism as a whole, you then start to get friendly to illiberals, such as autocrats like Putin. So I think some of this does stem from just faulty analysis. I think a lot of some analysts on the right seem to believe that class is the driving force behind this, and that there's some kind of upper class conspiracy to get wealth and power for themselves by introducing wokeness. I think there's no evidence for that. If you look at data, this is very much a battle of ideas. It cuts across class to a very large extent. So I don't think the class analysis is a useful one, but I think there are a number of analysts who seem to have fallen for this. And I think that's behind some of the mistakes they're making.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Eric Kaufman, Professor at Birkbeck, University of London. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. Well, hopefully very interesting discussions. That's all from us on The Discussion. See you at the same time next week. Up next, it's Nano Queer. Thank you.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking dry and clear for many, though it will chill off after sunset. Let's take a look at the details. Firstly, in the far southwest, there'll be some more cloud around here this evening, and perhaps even the odd spot of rain, but that cloud will keep temperatures up. Over to the east, and a clear, calmer end to the weekend, though in any rural areas it will start to feel pretty chilly around dusk. Moving back to the west, and in South Wales, there'll continue to be hardly a cloud in the sky tonight, chilly here as well. Next now to the Midlands, where you can see the odd spot of fog and mist developing this evening, but